Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the AVA webinar series. I'm your host, Jason Novick, the AVA webinar coordinator. Before we begin the presentation today, I'll share a couple of procedural things. First, in this Zoom webinar platform, that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speaker, Dr. Mendes, and we will make time at the end to discuss your questions at the end of this webinar. There will also be a survey, which I will send out to by email to all of the attendees, but there will be a link at the end of the webinar and in the chat to complete a feedback survey. And also, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit this and share this and our previous webinars. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the webinar today. I'm joining you today from the University of Calgary, which is located on the traditional territory of the Treaty 7 peoples, including the Blackfoot Confederacy and also the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda. And this land is also the traditional home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. On behalf of AVA, I want to begin by acknowledging that on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is Extortion and Deep Nudes, What You Need to Know, featuring Dr. Kaitlynn Mendes, sociology professor at Western University, where she also holds the Canada Research Chair in Inequality and Gender. She also leads the DIY Digital Safety Project, which has gathered information from over 2,000 Canadian teens about their experiences of online harm. Thank you so much, Dr. Mendes, for joining us today for this webinar, and I'll turn everything over to you.
Hey, hi everybody. Really appreciate you all taking the time to come and listen to this talk today. So yeah, we're going to be talking about sextortion and deep fake nudes. Um, and I always like to acknowledge, when I'm talking about these issues, that this isn't just abstract for me. I'm a researcher, but I'm also a mother. I have three boys, ages 14, 13, and 10. So these are issues I'm thinking about a lot. I'm also married to an elementary school teacher. And, you'd be surprised at how these issues are also coming up, even in elementary school. I am going to be showing some images. We're talking about a heavy topic. So I'd also like to just kind of give that kind of content warning and just to say if you find anything that's like distressing or upsetting, please just take care of yourself. If you need to leave the space, if you need to get up and stretch, just do that. So you only have me here today, but I always like to acknowledge that I work as part of a really great team. So on DIY digital safety, when I'm talking about things like the law, I'm drawing that information from Susie Dunn. She's a legal scholar at Dalhousie University. We have Alexa Dodge. She's a digital criminologist and is one of Canada's leading experts when it comes to intimate image sharing. We have Chris Dietzel, who's a postdoc with me here at Western, and his research is specifically for like queer communities and their experiences of these different forms of tech facilitated harms. So our team has gone around Canada for the past 4 years talking to teens about their experiences with technology. And I always like to emphasize that the aim of our research, I'm going to be talking about some scary things today, but I hope you don't take away, from this talk, this idea that like kids can never go online, that they shouldn't have access to devices. That's really not what we're saying. But we would like to use the information that we've learned and when we look at these bigger patterns to think about, what are the different measures and regulation and policy and education and guidance that we can put in place to eliminate some of these forms of harm and to support people who are experiencing them as well. So the agenda for what we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to make sure that I leave some time at the end for some questions, is, what do we know about technology and social media for youth? We're going to then look explicitly at sextortion, so sexual extortion, this kind of portmanteau of those different words. We're going to look at what are deep nudes. And we're going to also talk about how we can talk to young people about these issues. And I'm going to share with you some important resources that laws that are important to know about. So if we start with what are we hearing about in the news? I mean, these are big issues, both sextortion and deep nudes that we're hearing about. So here in London, where I live, there have been several cases where AI nude images, these deep nudes, have appeared where students are making them of their peers. We're hearing about sextortion and the dramatic rise of this, particularly where young boys are being targeted. And we've seen some very tragic cases where the boys have died by suicide as a result. So over the past few years, we've seen these different kinds of headlines that are talking about these risks and harms that are linked with digital technologies. And these are just two kinds of harms. And again, they're the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. But our team has also researched other ranges of harms, including different forms of online harassment, cyber stalking, the use of spy cams, like these secret cameras, like very small cameras that are used to take kind of these sexual photos, non-consensual sharing of intimate images. There's a huge amount of pressure to share images. And then, of course, deep fake nudes and sextortion. Okay, so some of you may already know what deep fakes and sextortion are, but they are relatively new, and I want to just take some time to talk about what we mean. So let's start with sextortion. So when I'm talking about sextortion, I'm talking about a type of blackmail where someone threatens to expose sexual images or videos of someone else to pressure them into providing more images. Maybe it's asking them for sex, money, or other favors. And it's really important to note that sextortion doesn't look the same for everyone. And this is something that we're going to kind of break down a little bit in the talk today. Um, and before I get to that, though, it's important to note that sextortion has significant consequences for people's mental health. It causes stress, anxiety, isolation, and self-harm. So our DIY digital safety team, if you go to our website, which is diydigitalsafety.ca, we have an infographic about sextortion, including things like what do you need to know? What does it include? What are the impacts? What should you do if you're being targeted? And other places that you can go to for support. Okay, so when we look broadly across the research on sextortion, we can see different patterns emerging. So the first is where we see extortion where minors are targeted. And this includes high victimization of girls and women. And we often see where boys and men are often the perpetrator and demands are typically sexual. So again, if we think about there are key gender differences for sextortion. We also see extortion by intimate partners. In this case, again, there's a high victimization of girls and women, and boys and men are often perpetrators. And here, demands are also typically sexual, or in many cases, it's to stop someone from leaving a relationship. So if you try to break up with me, I'm going to make sure that I send all of these intimate images to your friends and family. We also see extortion with stolen images. So in cases one and two, often these are images that are consensually taken or shared, although not always. But we also see this case in scenario three where these images are stolen. Or maybe the images were taken secretly, surreptitiously by hidden cameras. So this includes high victimization again of girls and women, and often the perpetrators are boys and men. And here again, the demands are typically sexual. So what we can see here is this pattern is that when we see girls and women are the targets of sextortion, unlike as we're going to see with boys and men, the demands are usually sexual in nature. They want more images, they want sex, or they want to stop someone from leaving a relationship. But in the final case here, we can see a new pattern emerging, which is where there's a high victimization of boys and men. And again, the perpetrators are typically men. And the demands here are typically financial. And this is what, when we look at organizations like CyberTip and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, when they're looking at their statistics, it's boys and men have been, dramatic rises in these kinds of cases. So what else do we know about sextortion so far? Well, again, this financial sextortion, so that's the last case that I'm talking about, is the most rapidly growing crime targeting children in the US, Canada, and Australia. So again, this is a screenshot that I took from CyberTip, who report getting more than 50 sextortion reports per week, and they're calling this a public safety emergency. And again, we've seen kind of widespread discussion of this after some really tragic cases. There was a 12-year-old boy from BC who died from suicide after he was sextorted on Snapchat and Instagram. There was a 17-year-old boy in Manitoba who also died by suicide 3 hours after being targeted by sextortion criminals. And I think there's something that's really important to recognize that when these boys and young men are being targeted, many of them who are engaging in these acts of self-harm are doing it very quickly. And again, in part, it's because messages that young people are often told is that if your intimate image gets leaked, if it gets out there, if it gets put online, your life is over. You're never going to get a job. You're never going to go to university. We often tell young people that this is so shameful and it will ruin their life. And this is something I'm going to talk about later in the webinar as well, about why we need to move away from those kinds of messaging and instead tell young people, like, yes, this might be incredibly difficult if intimate images get released, but it's something that you can overcome. And there's places where you can go for support. And there are ways of getting images taken down that I'm going to share with you later. Okay, so what do we know about those who are engaging in sextortion? And again, it really depends on the gender of the target. So we know in some cases, like what we saw with BC teen Amanda Todd, her sextorter was a lone man who was acting on his own. In growing number of cases, sextortion is run by organized gangs. And so I think this is something that's really important to recognize. So again, we know that girls are more likely to be targeted by either by individual men who are looking for sexual favors or images. Sometimes the girls consensually take or share these images or videos, but in other cases, they're taken without their knowledge or consent. The perpetrator threatens to share the images with family or friends if they don't comply. And again, when we look at what's happening with girls and women, it often takes place in the context of grooming. And again, this can take several weeks or months to establish connection. I see someone has their hand raised. I don't mind taking a question now, unless Jason, you prefer me to wait to the end.
Thank you. I would be fine if you were to take this question
Yeah,
now.
great. All
So,
right. Yeah, I'm happy to answer it.
so if you could please post your question in the chat, that would be great. I don't believe on the Zoom webinar platform that there's the capability to hear the audio. So
Great. Okay.
well, Duke, if you could please post your question in the chat and then she could address it. Thank you.
Okay. I'll just kind of continue just while I'm waiting for the question to come through. Is
Okay.
that this kind of sextortion is increasingly linked with human trafficking, again, where girls are pressured to engage in sexual acts for the perpetrators or others. And I think this is important because we often think of trafficking as when people leave their homes, like they're brought to another place. But I think it's important to recognize that with digital technologies, they don't have to. They can be at home continually sending these images or videos to perpetrators who may not even be in the same city. So that's an important factor to consider. Again, we know that for girls and women, they're often, although not always, targeted by an intimate partner. It can take place within the context of abusive relationships. Um, and in some cases where images are stolen or hacked, again, we see demands are typically sexual. Again, just kind of reiterating for boys. So we know that boys are more likely to be targeted by organized gangs of men, like the Yahoo Boys. So some of you have seen some reports about the Yahoo Boys. And we're hearing reports about how many of them work in groups. They share scripts and tactics. So, like, this is the message that you need to send. And what they will often do is they create these fake accounts. So they pretend to be teenage girls and they will use platforms like Instagram and Snapchat, and they will add. They will find a school, they will find a sports team, and they will add all of these people on those teams. And again, it's interesting, especially a platform like Snapchat, because it will often recommend mutuals. So if I see someone is adding me and I say, oh, well, like they're a friend of a friend, it must be legitimate. They must be someone that I know. And that kind of creates a sense of safety for these young people. So these extorters will create these fake accounts. Again, we call this catfishing. They pretend to be a teenage girl. They start to flirt. They will send, intimate images or what the boys think to be intimate images of themselves and ask for one in return. And then as soon as the boys send the intimate image, that's when the extortion starts. So Instagram and Snapchat are the two most common places where boys are targeted. We also now know that with the use of generative AI and face swapping technology, it's very easy to create fake nudes to speed up these sextortion tactics. And it's incredibly difficult to prosecute these cases because, again, often cases, these people are not in the local jurisdiction. They may not be in the same country. It's not clear who they are. And if you are going to result in successful criminal prosecution, it requires international cooperation to find them, extradite them, and prosecute these people. Now, there have been recently some large crackdowns and arrests, but this is very small numbers. And I think it's unrealistic to think that we will ever catch and stop all of them because of the incredibly widespread nature of this extortion. Okay, I think it's important to recognize here, like, what are social media companies doing? Many of you probably have heard, Canada recently announced the Safer Social Media Act that's like promising or proposing to ban under 16s from social media. We've seen Australia do it. We're seeing France. Many other countries around the world are either adopting these measures or talking about adopting them. And I've been someone who's actually been quite critical of the bans because I think that it's targeting the wrong thing. I think we're going to spend our time policing children when we should really be targeting social media companies and making them create products that are safe by design. And we know so far that social media companies have largely refused to take responsibility or implement protections against sextortion. So they could do things like verifying user identities. They could do things like by default block friend lists of teen accounts. They can also prevent nude images from being sent to and from teen accounts. And in fact, actually, even very recently, we've seen some devices like Apple, for example, is trying to kind of like blur, potentially ban youth from sending nude images. There's also questions about that because digital technologies do play an important role in consensual sexual relationships and development. One could argue that if there are people who are consensually having sex, which is legal, is it okay for them to send each other nude images? So the kind of blanket banning is something that some scholars are worried about. So Instagram recently has made a few of these changes. So if your child signs up with their actual age, by default, the account is set to private. So only approved followers can see their content and get direct messages. That, of course, requires that a child signs up with their actual age and isn't lying about their age. Um, Instagram also says that it restricts the sensitive content. So it doesn't stop them from sending nudes, but blurs images that are suspected of containing nudity. And Snapchat actually also recently introduced a measure when a friend request is blocked if it comes from someone with no mutual connections. But then all it takes is for one mutual to bypass this feature. So again, I often think these tech companies will introduce these new safety measures, but they don't announce things like what is the uptake. So I think it was last week, it was Meta introduced some new measures, but it requires like the parent to have linked their account with their teen's account. And I've heard some reports that it's as low as 2% of parents are doing this. So again, how widespread are these measures, I think is quite difficult to say. So what can you do if your child is experiencing sextortion? Well, first, I think it's important that as a parent or someone who's working with young people, that if you're talking to someone who's experienced sextortion, that you don't blame or shame them. And I think it's important to emphasize how being a target of sextortion violates their rights. And this is a quote that I really like from an RCMP Staff Sergeant, Natalie Davis, who says, "Online child exploitation, and that's what's happening here, is a profound violation of trust and safety. Our priority is to protect children, support victims, and hold offenders accountable. And children need to know they're never to blame. If something goes wrong online, we want them and their caregivers to feel safe coming forward." So often parents and adults tell children, Don't ever talk to strangers online. Don't ever send nude images of yourself. And again, we know, and I know from my own research with Canadian teens, that many young people do not want to come to adults when things go wrong. So if they're experiencing sextortion, they definitely don't want to tell their parents or their teachers because the messaging that they've been given their whole life is only an idiot would talk to a stranger online. You'd have to be so stupid to take or send a nude image of yourself. So we want to kind of create these conditions where young people can come forward and tell us what's going on, and that our response isn't, oh my God, like I cannot believe that you did that. You were so stupid to do that. That's going to stop them from coming forward. There are other resources out there for what you can do. So for example, our own DIY digital safety, we have some infographics here. And then there's this one poster here that has been put up around different kinds of schools where it explains what sextortion is, about how you can do things like stop chatting with them, take screenshots of the text in their profile, block the account and report it to the platform, but don't delete your own account. And then you can get support from places like cybertip.ca. Recommends do not comply with more images or money, don't respond to demands, and don't continue any further conversation. So stop conversing. But it is important to recognize that some extorters, especially the financial ones, they may come through on their demands. So they may send your intimate image to your friends and family. So you can even do things like preempt friends and family and say, listen, this is what's going on. You may receive a message. Here's, please don't open it, please delete it, please report them. If you know what the image is, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, there's some technology called hashing technology, which puts a digital watermark on the image. And it basically means that if an extorter tries to post this image to a public website, it gets taken down in real time. So that's really important to know. Um, I also want to communicate with young people. So some young people are also told that if I'm a teenager and if I took an intimate image of myself and I shared it with someone, consensually or non-consensually, that I might be charged with child sexual abuse material, with child pornography. And in Canada, that is not the case. So some young people may say, okay, I know I'm being extorted. I know that this is wrong, but I'm scared to come forward because, and what the extorters will often tell the children is that they will be charged with creating or disseminating child pornography. When you took that picture of yourself, you were creating child porn. When you shared that image with me, you were disseminating child pornography. In Canada, that we have an exemption under the Supreme Court that recognizes consensual image sharing is legal as long as it's within the legal sexual ages. So someone is, say, 13 years old, they're allowed to take, excuse me, a sexual image of themselves. They're not going to be charged with child pornography. So really reassuring young people that taking those images is not illegal in the Canadian context. It's different depending on different countries around the world. If someone's experiencing sextortion, though, we definitely recommend reporting the incident to cybertip.ca or the local police, and please reaching out for emotional support. So I mentioned about help getting intimate images removed. In Canada, we also have Need Help Now. Again, this is if you're worried about a nude image of yourself that has been shared online. There are ways of getting these images removed, including Project Arachnid, which I mentioned here. And so again, this is amazing technology called hashing technology. You register the image, you like upload the image to a secure site. It gets digitally watermarked, it's called hashed, and then the technology scans the internet. So if it finds that this image has been uploaded to Pornhub, it sends a takedown notice to Pornhub. And if someone is trying to upload the image in real time, it removes it. So we can see here from the screenshot, as of July 2026, there have been 141 million takedown issues noticed. They've processed 176 billion images. And so this is really important technology that we all need to know. We need to stop telling kids that, once your image is out there, it's out there forever. Now, Project Arachnid deals with those who are under the age of 18, but I think it's always important to recognize that there's this website, stopncii.org, that's for those over the age of 18. So if you're over the age of 18 and you have an intimate image that's shared, you can go to this website. It's run out of the UK, but they will process images from anywhere around the world. And then finally, I always like just sharing and reminding people that we have the Kids Help phone. And this is an anonymous, confidential support that young people can reach out to. They can be called, kids can text them. In my own home, I have the phone number just put up on a whiteboard. And I always tell my kids, I hope that if there's something that's, impacting you, you feel like you can come talk to me. But if not, here's the Kids Help phone line. Again, it's anonymous, it's confidential. They don't have to give their name. It's not going to come back to me as the parent. So I can't actually see if it's been put in the chat. So I'm going to kind of carry on for now. I want to move on to talk about deepfake nudes. So legally, we can think of these deepfake nudes as non-consensual synthetic intimate images. So if you're reading laws, they're often referred in the laws as this NSII. So when we're talking about, and I'm going to call them deep nudes or deep fake nudes, this include images where a person is depicted as nude or semi-nude, where their genitals, anal region, or breasts are exposed, or if they're shown engaged in sexually explicit activity. So back in the day, and these deep fake nude images are not new, but before generative AI, they may have been created using Photoshop to maybe superimpose someone's face on the body of a sexual image. But now the tech is so sophisticated that users don't need any skills whatsoever to create these deep fake images and videos. And we're seeing the development of AI apps to do this for free and in seconds. So some of you may remember earlier this year, Grok, which is an application that could easily be kind of configured with X. This was like their AI app, and people were using this to create sexualized images of children. It wasn't fully nudifying them, but say it was taking like 8-year-olds and you can put them in a string bikini and, in very sexual positions. And so the Grok scandal, and this is not an isolated failure of one platform. That's something I'd really like to emphasize. So this isn't just about Grok. Grok's the problem, and it wasn't a whoopsie doopsie. That this is a symptom of a global system that's allowed AI to evolve faster than protections that children need are entitled to. And so there was one study that found that Grok was producing sexualized images of a child every 41 seconds. And unlike nudifying apps, so which actually like completely undresses someone, makes them totally nude, Grok wasn't making people fully nude, but it was undressing them and showing them in like bikinis and very little clothing. And this is actually quite interesting from a legal perspective because it doesn't necessarily count as child sexual abuse material because they're not fully nude. So in many cases, what was happening with Grok didn't quite meet that threshold for child pornography. It's this legal loophole that it was occupying. Um, there are other apps, however, that completely nudify people, and they're easy to find and they're free. They're often put on the App Store, but quickly taken down, but they're still easy to find. So I recently just went and did a search. Could I find some nudifying apps? And I found a number of them. And some of them are really interesting, like this one, X-Ray, removes clothes. And it's talking about it as if it's a joke, like, ha ha ha, you can play a prank on your friends by making them naked. So again, sometimes they're like, it's very clear, like these ones here, it's very clear that the purpose is to undress women, but in some cases it's framed as in like, this is just a really funny joke and we'll play a prank on someone. But just some other screenshots of what these nudifying apps look like. These are screenshots that I've taken. This was an app called Nudify. Again, let's read it here. It's an online application offering a free service for undressing any girl. Again, I find the language, which is very infantilizing, very problematic. You can choose age, body type. You can pay more for high quality rendering. There are no age restrictions yet for using Nudify online. And I think this is important, the language where they're really kind of saying to people, hey, it's okay, you're allowed to do this, you're not breaking the law. Here's another one. This is clothes off, undress photo for free with clothes off. And again, they're bragging about, the volume, 2 million photos processed, really high satisfaction, and these images can be done with under 15 seconds. And again, most of these available apps and platforms and AI tools don't contain ethical limits with respect to age. They will equally generate a photo of a child or an adult. And again, we see this infantilizing language here. Here's just another one that, again, they're very explicit about this is for girls. And in fact, when I've read kind of the print on some of them, um, they will explicitly say that they cannot nudify men because the training data that they're using is only of women. So here's a quote from one: "Deep nude technology was not intended for use with male subjects as the training data was primarily concentrated on female." So that's this one Deep Nude CA. And we know from international research that most deep nudes are made of women by men. Now, some deepfake creators, consumers, and even researchers claim that these deep nudes don't cause harm because they're not real. But there is increasingly research from international studies that disagree. So there is a study by some folks who did a survey of nearly 17,000 people across 10 countries, and most of them identified that deep nudes were harmful, and they actually supported legal interventions. When it comes to the law, and it depends on the circumstances, being deep nuded may or may not be a criminal offense. So in June, so just last month, we had Bill C-16 in Canada. So this is the Protecting Victims Act, which actually expanded the definition of intimate images to include deep nudes. And so that's actually really important because we had some cases prior where a perpetrator, someone who was creating deep nudes, wasn't charged because it was deemed that the images were not authentic. They were synthetic. They were not real. But we've now had this new bill, new piece of legislation come into play that's changed that. So that's criminally, but on the civil level, most provinces also now have legislation if someone distributes deep nudes without your consent. And again, the focus here is still on distribution rather than creation. So in British Columbia, for example, there's the Intimate Images Act, which if someone creates a deep nude of you and is distributing it, you can not only get quick takedown, so sometimes within 24 hours, but you can also sue them. And the limit used to be $5,000, but they recently just raised the limit. I don't misquote me here, but I think it's something like $80,000. Like they significantly raised the ceiling on the monetary compensation that someone can get. Again, we know that even though the images aren't real, with deep nudes, research shows that they cause harm and they violate people's right to dignity, protection from exploitation. And again, this is the messaging that we often give when we go and talk to young people or when we talk to other people about deep nudes, right? So, it undermines our privacy, our digital identity, and it can fuel harassment, coercion, and long-term psychological harm. Um, we know that these deep nudes can be used to threaten and shame and silence young people. And again, the fear of these images being created or shared can be as damaging as the images themselves. Again, we just kind of mentioned how most people recognize that deep nudes are harmful, they're not a joke, and again, really just to emphasize that they violate people's right to privacy, bodily autonomy, and sexual integrity. And one thing I tell a lot of young people is just as in physical spaces, you have the right to determine who sees your body naked, who touches your body naked, those same rights should apply in the digital space. We should all have control over who gets to see intimate images of us and how we're positioned. So even I talk to my own kids about this and trying to explain to them why someone who's creating a deep nude for their own personal use might think, well, I'm not hurting anybody, but really trying to kind of emphasize that you are still violating someone's bodily autonomy and sexual integrity by generating these images of other people. Just thinking about addressing deep nudes, governments are considering expanding legislation to the creation of deep nudes. They're thinking about it. Again, this issue is quite fraught because, again, some people might argue that, well, you're not hurting anybody by creating these images. So I think that one's going to be difficult to address. And I think we need to have open and regular conversations with youth about deep nudes, how even though they may not be illegal, they still violate people's rights. Um, So I see that there's some questions in the chat. Oh, I see. That's someone just telling us to use questions. Okay, perfect. So there are some things, if you're an adult who works with young people, if you're a parent, there's some things that you can do. So teaching young people how to be an upstander. If they see or suspect non-consensual distribution of intimate images, real or fake, what can you do? So can you call someone out if someone shares a deep nude or an authentic intimate image in a group chat? What could you do? And these are, I think, are really important conversations we should be having with young people. Like, would you feel comfortable calling out the person who did it and letting them know that actually non-consensual distribution of intimate images is not only illegal in Canada, but again, it violates people's important rights? Would you reach out if you knew who the person in the image was? Would you reach out to them and let them know? Are there ways that you could support them? Are there ways that you could register this image as a hash to make sure that it doesn't spread? What are some things that you could do? And again, it really kind of depends on the context. But just talking about being that upstander, I think, is important. Reminding young people that they should never share a nude that has been sent to them non-consensually. And again, so if someone shares you this image, what are things that you can do? Tell the person no, delete the image. That non-consensual distribution of intimate images is not okay. And how can adults do this? Okay, so we can talk to kids about tech. Um, can't just be one big conversation. Again, you hear something in the news, you see something talked about in a TV program, use that as like an opening to address this. Um, Tech is going to change over time, and they're evolving and developing at such a fast rate that it's changing. So just try to have regular conversations with young people about, what are you hearing? You know, I heard this on the news. Like, have you ever heard this happening in your classroom? What would you do? So I really like these kind of teachable moments and everyday events to start these discussions. Role play through the different scenarios. So ask them, like, do you know, who would you go to for help? Is this something you would even feel comfortable going to? Is there something that you could do to challenge the perpetrator or support the victim? And again, sometimes I say this particularly to parents, that some of these conversations can be easier when you're not face to face. So sometimes when you're in the car or if you're going for a walk, those can be great times to have these conversations because it doesn't feel as intense, kind of the eye contact. And then, like I mentioned, in my own home, we have the Kids Help phone line that's on the whiteboard. The kids know where it is. And so just letting young people know, you know, I mentioned Kids Help phone line, but there's Need Help Now, there's Cyber Tip, there are other places that people can turn to for help. So we want to teach young people about their rights, that young people have a right to privacy and bodily autonomy and sexual integrity, that people should have control over their sexual boundaries and experiences, whether this is online or in person. It includes who gets to touch them, view intimate images of them. And it also means when I speak to young people about sharing other people's images without consent, I don't just emphasize the law, right? It's not just you might go to jail if this happens, but I teach them about how it's wrong to share someone's nudes because you're violating their rights. And so let's focus on teaching young people how to behave ethically, not just how to avoid punishment. I definitely encourage skepticism about what people see, hear, and are asked to do online. I'm constantly asking my kids, what are they seeing online? Is it real? How do you know that it's real? Why might someone try to trick you in this case? How could this information or this image that I'm sharing be used against me? We always try to teach young people to think before they act, or post, but of course, young people's brains are still developing. So, you know, they often make rash decisions, but it doesn't mean we stop reminding them to slow down, to think about what they're doing. And then just really to get them to consider what is okay or not okay to share about others online. You know, when is it okay to share someone's picture or a private conversation? And it's again important to get young people to think about these different scenarios as they're going. So, I'm just going to kind of point out my email address is there if anybody has like further thoughts that they want to ask about. If you want to check out our website, DIYdigitalsafety.ca, I'm very happy to answer more questions. On our website, we have infographics on things like nudes and the law, know your rights, um, sharing nude images. There's a whole range of other tips there. So I'm going to stop speaking and open the floor up for questions.
Thank you so much for your insightful and timely presentation. This is greatly appreciated and very informative for the AVA webinar audience. So, as we have mentioned, that please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. I do have a couple of questions of interest, and specifically, the first one relates to platform governance, I'm sorry. So
Mhm.
given that platforms like Snapchat and Instagram account for a majority of reported sextortion cases, as you have noted, from your perspective, what specific regulatory or technical leverage do we actually have to force platforms to implement structural protections, as you had recommended, rather than relying on voluntary compliance?
That's such a great question. Right now, there really is very little that a country like Canada, for example, can do. So, other countries, when we look at the UK, when we look at Australia, when we look kind of across Europe more broadly, they have pieces of legislation and they have these digital ombudsmen that require these tech companies to do things like produce transparency reports. They can issue fines. They can stop these platforms from operating in their context. In Canada, we don't have that yet. Again, the Safer Social Media Act is proposing to introduce this regulator, which is incredibly important because right now, yeah, we really have very little leverage in forcing these companies to do anything, and that's a huge problem. So the companies care about their reputation, so sometimes they will preemptively kind of make these changes. But again, I often call it care washing because they won't say how widely adopted are these measures. Or like I mentioned with the Instagram, it was like the parent and teen app already have to be connected for some of those features to work. And often the case, like, parents and teens don't have their apps connected. Teens can just start a new account. So there are many ways of like bypassing some of these kind of safety features. So I would just say there's very little regulation and oversight of the tech companies right now.
Thank you for speaking to the importance of platform governance and recommendations for legal protections, for example, as you noted, within specific European countries. And something of interest associated with this question is, let's say that there is an instance whereby, for example, sextortion is occurring and that law enforcement within a Canadian context get involved, but it is determined that there is a group, for example, with the groups that you have highlighted, undertaking the sextortion located outside of Canada. And so, what enforcement mechanisms are available? I know that there are important protective measures that could be undertaken for the person who has been victimized by sextortion. But in such an instance, you think about the international legal realm, what measures might be available?
Yeah, well, it's very, very difficult. So it requires a lot of international cooperation. It also requires the police to have the investigative capabilities and knowledge and training. So even just this morning, I was in another meeting with some Ontario police that were talking about how some units, like for example, in Toronto, there's like a special unit that knows how to kind of investigate these online crimes, but that's one particular unit within Toronto. Um, if we look across the rest of Ontario, if we look across Canada, um, different municipalities, different provinces may be funded differently. So not everybody has access to that specialized training. So it's possible that if you even go to your local police and report that this is happening to me, depending on where you are, the police really may not have the expertise that they need to investigate this. So I think that definitely requires some more joined up thinking. How can we create national level or provincial or territorial level kind of standards for police to kind of get this training, and then how can we make sure that they're cooperating with one another? So It's very difficult, it's expensive, it's time consuming. Unfortunately, there really are no easy answers. And then again, it requires that there's cooperation with the other country. So, in the case of Amanda Todd, for example, and I find that really interesting because those of you who remember the story of Amanda Todd, who died by suicide after she was groomed and bullied and harassed, and she was sextorted. At the time of her death, it was called bullying, but now we recognize, oh no, it was this pattern where she was targeted, she was groomed, she was extorted. And it was actually a man who was from the Netherlands, and he ended up being extradited to Canada. He was prosecuted. He's serving his time in prison in the Netherlands. Those kinds of cases are very, very rare because they're very time consuming and very expensive. So really sadly to say that there just are no easy solutions, and most people who engage in sextortion will never be prosecuted.
Unfortunately. And thank you for highlighting the horrific consequences that are associated, for example, with this famous horrific case of dying by suicide, and accordingly and also highlighting how unfortunately it's very difficult to enforce if we consider within an international context, even when such instances are reported to law enforcement. And specifically, let's say hypothetically that there was a minor who had reported being victimized by sextortion, and unfortunately that law enforcement weren't able to stop or prosecute the individual, then which protective measures would be undertaken to ensure that the individual can stop being victimized?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it depends on like the victimization. So again, if you're worried about them contacting you, because perpetrators can create new accounts, try to find ways of like contacting the person. So that's about like really changing privacy settings to make the so that you can't just be added by random strangers. But there's also protective measures in terms of if you don't want that image shared, using the hashing technology, so registering it with Project Arachnid so that which is constantly, I mean, it's automatically scanning the internet. And if someone is trying to upload that image in real time, it gets taken down in real time. Or if it has been found to have been posted to a website, they will issue a takedown notice. And so, companies have a certain amount of time to get that image taken off of the web. But then there's also, of course, the emotional support. So, young people, if you've experienced this extortion, there can be shame, embarrassment, anxiety, stigma that's associated. So, it's also important to make sure that we are emotionally supporting someone, reminding them that their life is not over, that yes, this might be incredibly difficult, it might be incredibly embarrassing, but it's something that you can overcome. And then also, this is the message about like if someone sends you a nude that you know was taken or shared non-consensually, please delete it. Like, get rid of it, report it, block it, be an upstander, and make sure that, we all have a role to play in upholding other people's rights as well.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I really appreciate your recommendations for urgent policy and operational change that needs to occur, along with how families respond to such instances of sextortion. And also, I see in the chat that Ken Hopkins has a question, and he's wondering if there has been any consultation with the Department of Justice, provincially and federally.
So again, Ken, are we talking about sextortion or nude images or just online harm and online safety? Because again, there's kind of different layers to this question. So if we're thinking about like legislation, we have the Safer Social Media Act, um, which has certain protections that they're really kind of like trying to stop. Um, the headline from that piece of legislation is that Canada is going to ban under 16s from social media. But the part that actually didn't get a lot of media coverage was unless social media companies can prove that they're safe by design and that they're doing things like risk assessments to preempt and to like understand that when they introduce a new feature, how that might lead to something like extortion or how it might enable something like deep nudes. So doing those kinds of things and then having the mechanism to hold those companies accountable. And then again, at the provincial level, we see civil legislation, which is really, for a lot of victims, if you have an intimate image, real or fake, um, making sure that there are mechanisms to get them quickly taken down, to have access to non-judgmental supports. Like most victims say, like the thing that they want the most is just the image to be removed. They want it taken down. They don't want it there. They don't necessarily want to sue someone. They don't necessarily want to prosecute someone. They just want the image removed. And so, Ken, you're talking about more the image making and sharing and the harm. So there's a lot of discussion. So my colleague Susie Dunn, she regularly consults with the government, especially around the creation of these deep fake nude images. And again, it's kind of a gray zone because some people will say things like, well, if you are attracted to minors, isn't it better that you're creating child sexual abuse material than actually going and getting authentic child sexual abuse material? There's that argument there. Um, I'm not saying that I agree with that argument, but some people would argue that it's better that, the images are synthetic, that they're not real, rather than having authentic images of abuse. And so I don't even quite know like where I sit on that. For sure, I think when it comes to the dissemination or distribution of these images, that should not be allowed. And actually, up until this piece of legislation was passed, um, adults could disseminate intimate images of like they could deep nude each other and that wasn't illegal. So with this new piece of legislation that was just passed last month, now it's illegal for adults. It was illegal for adults to deep nude children that they were prosecuted under child sexual abuse material or child pornography laws. But adults could deep nude each other. And so changes are being made, but it's complicated, it's slow, the tech is evolving so fast. Even when we think about the last social media kind of legislation that was introduced in 2024, generative AI and these deep nude apps weren't that popular, so it wasn't addressing them. Now, with this new piece of legislation, we're thinking about that. Now we need to be thinking about chatbots and what role chatbots might be playing in terms of maybe giving information on like how can you create a great deep nude of someone or what is a script I could use to sextort someone. So the tech is always changing and it just feels like it's a constant game for us of catch up, which is again why I really advocate we need safety by design. We need these companies to do risk assessments. I think like we can learn a lot from consumer protection legislation, like why are we letting these faulty products or products that we know cause harm or companies that haven't even thought about the kinds of harms that are being produced? Why are we accepting them to just be out there in society without these kind of safeguarding measures in place and then accountability measures in place? So when things go wrong, um, like how can we make sure that tech companies are responding quickly, that they're recognizing the harm that their products by design are enabling or causing?
Absolutely. And thank you for your important insights and for your important questions, Ken. And with AI also being a moving target, because
Mhm.
of course that passing legislation takes time. And as you noted, that the technology aspect is evolving so quickly. And so absolutely that legislators and policymakers need to keep on top of the emerging tech. And I'm greatly appreciative of your valuable expertise and research and insights in this regard and policy consultation that you're also undertaking. And so the final question I have regarding how to best support marginalized groups. So, for example, how research has highlighted a higher
Mhm.
prevalence of online harms experienced by LGBTQ plus youth, for example. And so, overall, what unique barriers do marginalized youth face when seeking help from traditional supports, like from law enforcement,
Yeah.
parents, the educational institution, and how can community organizations build safer reporting channels?
That's such a great point. So, and actually, I didn't even mention that we know the research about LGBTQ plus folks, when they experience sextortion, it's often as a form of like harassment, bullying, and outing them. So often, if they're extorted, it's someone saying, I know your sexual or gender identity, and I'm going to tell your whole community about it unless you comply with my various demands. So it looks even different for kind of those under that like queer umbrella. Anonymous, judgment-free supports are incredibly important. When we look at provinces like Nova Scotia, they have a unit called CyberScan that can help people get intimate images like removed offline, but they're also a place where you can go for that emotional support. That's often what people want. So they want their experience to be validated. They want to be able to tell someone and ask for help in a way that they're not going to be blamed or shamed or exposed. So, as much as we're investing in legislation, and I think that that's really important, I think we also absolutely need to be investing in community organizations. So, having organizations that particularly support these different marginalized folks, whether it's those who are Indigenous, racialized, and the LGBTQ plus spectrum is incredibly important as well. And so having folks who understand their particular needs and their particular experiences really matters. But, Jason, going to the police, if you're like, oh, this has happened to me, and, you know, maybe the response is, well, you were so stupid for sending that picture in the first place. We can't have that kind of response. And we also know that there's many communities who don't want to go to the police, who they have, they're historically have been criminalized. They don't trust the police. So also recognizing that when it comes to legislation, some people will never trust the police and go to them in the first place. So we need to make sure we have these alternative sources of support and information.
Absolutely. I'm very appreciative of your policy recommendations and guidelines for how to best support those who are seeking support when they have dealt with such examples as sextortion and deep nudes. So that's greatly appreciated in terms of your recommendations. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time to share such crucial, timely, and actionable insights. And as was discussed, that this involves keeping on top of the technological advancements, but also deep empathy and proactive community leadership. And so I believe that your expertise and your research has given us a clear roadmap for how to better protect and empower youth. And as we wrap up today, I'd like to encourage everyone to take these insights back to your respective schools, organizations, and communities with the overarching mandate of continuing to build safer digital environments together. So thank you so much for taking the time today to share your valuable insights.
Thanks everybody so much for coming.